But I'd like to turn it over to Sam Carlton to give us our talk. Thanks again, Sam.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks for letting me talk. As you said, my name's Sam Carlton. I am a web consultant from Tulsa with a decade of experience in scaling through web performance. If while I'm talking, you guys hear something that you like, or then feel free to drop some lightning bolts in the chat for our performance speed, or ask questions in the chat as I'm talking if you think of them. And so how this is going to work today, I have 3 parts of this talk, and then at the end, we'll have time for questions. And so we'll just get right into it. And so what we're talking about today is the good deal with Google search and speed, and what Core Web Vitals is and how that has to do with it. So what is Core Web Vitals? So, oh, and by the way, if you want to, if you see there's a sam.lc/faster, that's the resources link. And you can also, if you want to, you can see this is running on slides.com. You can view this on slides.com as I'm talking. So what is Core Web Vitals? So Google has introduced a new search ranking signal on how it decides the order of search. And so that's literally, the order of where your page or your site goes when search results are chronologically ordered or are ordered in however Google wants to order them. And so what that means is performance now has a bigger impact, bigger business impact. So before it started out in an early stage where Google, and Aaron and I were talking about this a little bit before the talk, Google started rolling out these stats that they wanted people to make their sites faster because it was just a better customer experience. And some organizations started to take that seriously, but it didn't have as big of an impact as they wanted. And so they did a series of kind of like a Think with Google where they shared stats on the business impact of web performance. And that had a slightly bigger impact, but not as much as they wanted. And so now what Core Web Vitals is Google is taking those high performance sites, and because they want their Google search experience to be the best possible, if you have a equivalent, like a site that has equivalent relevancy, there are 2 sites that are equivalently relevant, and one of them is faster, that site will get listed first. And so this is just another step for Google to get organizations to take speed seriously. And you should be building quick sites for a user. You should be building good user experiences. Now you just have a better business case for it. So how does this work? Well, the impact that this has is you can measure the increase in traffic that Google is sending you, and you can actually see. So this is an example I pulled from my site. This is actually an older metric. I'll show you guys the newer numbers later on. But this is the impressions of a side project I built, and I specifically optimized it for Core Web Vitals, just as an experiment for my client projects. And it's led to about a 15% increase in traffic month over month. And that it's all I had to do was make it fast and keep it fast. Now it can be a little bit of a moving bar sometimes because they're still updating and tweaking it, and sometimes they'll make it a little more fair. Sometimes they may make it a little more difficult to reach on other parts. But within Search Console, they give you these tools to measure this. And if you go to the resources link, and this is just the sam.lc/faster, you can find a link in here that says check good page experience on your current site. And what that'll do is it'll load up this page like this, and you'll have to click through your domain properties and pick one. And then if that domain property is showing good page experience so far, like if it's reporting those good page experience results, then you'll see which percentage of your pages have good page experience so far. And so you can kind of actually see the real impact this is having on your own sites that you either work with or you manage for your clients. So it works a little bit like this. First, you have Core Web Vitals passing. And when you have Core Web Vitals passing, that means you get a good page experience clicks. And once you get the good page experience clicks, then you get traffic. The funny thing is, Google hasn't like that 15% bump in traffic, that's only for mobile. So Google, all the benefit and all the craze that people, if you may have heard about this and heard people talked about it, this is only applying for mobile devices. So there's still yet to come another traffic increase, a traffic boost for sites that pass Core Web Vitals from desktop devices. They're just focusing on mobile first because that was the critical area, the weakest area that needed the most improvement. So, and then once you get traffic, obviously that, if you're in an e-commerce situation, that can very easily easily correlate that to profit, or just better experience with your users, whatever goal your web property is trying to get to. So how do you measure each of these at each point? Well, Core Web Vitals passing, you can measure, and this is the part most of you guys have probably heard about, WebDev or Lighthouse. And so the website is https://web.dev. And it's kind of a overall tool for it measures your performance, but also accessibility, best practices in SEO as Google sees it. And then there's the Lighthouse suite, which is built into Chrome now. And you can also use it from GitHub and actually run it on your own device, and it's used for automating these tests. And so once you get your passing, then you can measure the impact that Core Web Vitals passing has on your site through Google Search Console, through that page I showed you earlier. And then once that impact comes in, then you can measure the actual impact that it has on your traffic through your normal analytics, whether it be Fathom, Google Analytics, or whatever you happen to be using. So what does it mean to pass? Like how does pass Core Web Vitals work? What are even Core Web Vitals? So Core Web Vitals are there's 3 metrics in the Lighthouse suite of tests that Google wants you to focus on. The first is largest contentful paint. The second is first input delay, and the last is cumulative layout shift. So largest contentful paint, it's kind of the closest analog to load. If you guys are familiar with JavaScript, you've probably heard of DOM content loaded or the ready. In jQuery, I think they have the ready state, like the ready function or event. The problem with those is that things can still end up loading after those events, and so counting that as the page is loaded isn't quite accurate to the actual user, the way the user experiences the page in real life. So what largest contentful paint does is it takes the initial paint, the initial screen that you have on your device, and whatever the largest element on that screen, whenever that's done painting, that's the end of the largest contentful paint metric. So from the initial request to when that largest contentful paint has finished rendering. That ends, and as you can see, you can see if the numbers are a little bit small, but underneath each of these slides you have good, needs improvement, poor. And you can see LCP for, if your LCP is under 2.5 seconds, that's great. If it's under 4 seconds, between 2.5 and 4 seconds, then that means you need to improve it. So moving on to first input delay. First input delay is actually a metric that can't be tracked with Lighthouse on a manual Lighthouse test. It can only be tracked with a real user, because the first input a user is going to make, whether it's a click, whether it's a typing, whether it's a tabbing, is going to be different on different sites. And so as Google collects data from Chrome in the real world, they'll use that first input delay. There's a similar metric that's close to first input delay, but not exact. And generally, your Lighthouse scores, when you score them, they're going to be a little harsher than the real world metrics that you're going to see, which is on purpose. They want you to take a little bit extra care, make sure it works good. Sometimes it can be the other way around though. And then finally, cumulative layout shift. This is visual stability. This is when you have things on a page where you have an image that you have a size set wrong, and when the image actually loads in, it ends up being taller or shorter, and that causes a bump. And so as the page is loading, when it's jumping around, if there's an empty space and then an ad is injected into that empty space and it gets big, that increases the cumulative layout shift towards the poor side. And this is measured on the ratio of change in the page. And so 0.1 is good, like less than 0.1 is good. And then between 0.1 and 0.25, it needs improvement, and more than 0.25 is going to be poor. So how do these three metrics work together? So you're going to go through and if you score your pages right now on PageSpeed Insights or WebDev, you might see some of the metrics are good and some of the metrics are either poor or needs improvement. If so, in the first scenario, if any of your three metrics of these three metrics is poor, you do not get a search ranking benefit. You do not get good page experience until you fix that. If any of these metrics are orange, so it's a kind of a mix between green and orange, that means you might get a search ranking benefit out of it, but it's not guaranteed. It might happen, but if there's somebody who's doing better in your category, then they're definitely going to score higher. But you might not get the search ranking benefit at all. If you pass on green on all three metrics, then you're guaranteed to get a search ranking benefit because so few sites are using this. Now, if you go even past green, so you can see some of these metrics like LCP is anything less than 2.5 seconds is green. Past green, let's say your LCP is let's say a competitor is passing on all Web Vitals, and they're passing LCP on like 2.4 seconds. You can still outrank them if you can get your LCP lower than theirs. So past green, it's just a measuring scale. It's just whoever is fastest. So there are some misconceptions about ranking, Google ranking fast sites. It's not, because the core Web Vitals is not the most important ranking factor. That's going to be relevance, and then there's other things like security, how well the site is going to work on the device, so mobile responsive, things like that. Core Web Vitals does become important in areas like competitive search, so commerce, content marketing can be very competitive. Content marketing, you're going to want this, and then there's other smaller examples. Traffic increases based on real device performance. So even though you may see, and I forgot to mention field data and lab data. So when you test on Lighthouse or on PageSpeed Insights, those results that you see for your page are called lab data. And because those aren't from real users, that's a simulated test, it's a simulated score. It's kind of it's doing its best to give you the closest version of a preview of what your real score will be. The lab data, on the other hand, that you can find in Google Search Console or on PageSpeed Insights, that is the real user data that gets recorded from real users interacting with your site. So this is an important distinction. They're not just depending on whatever the Lighthouse says your score is in the simulated test. That doesn't impact the real world, like the real search ranking at all. It's what real people experience when they actually go to your site, and so this works when you get that ranking. It's going to be based on what the real data is. So if for some reason, and I've never seen this happen before, if for some reason the real world data is worse than the lab data, then you have to fix that real world data. Larger sites are going to have a hard time fixing this, just because when you have a lot of content or when you have a kind of a legacy system, legacy code base, it can be tricky to turn around that ship. There's a lot of optimizations you can do on the back end, but most of the fixes are going to be on the front end for this stuff. Field data is a 28-day average of all the visits, or of all the recorded visits, I should say. So field data is, if you fix it and you start reporting new requests that are passing our core Web Vitals, that doesn't necessarily mean you're all the way in the green. Usually it starts to capture, like you start to qualify for ranking benefits when that good score has been recorded for as the average of 28 days. So when you fixed it and it stayed fixed for 28 days around. It can be shorter or longer depending on how dramatic the fix is and other factors. Also, pages can be grouped. You're not necessarily going to get one score for your whole site. You might if it's a smaller site, but in some cases you might get, if your product pages are super fast but your blog pages are super slow, well then it might give a separate score for those, and those will get different ranking intensities. Generally, you want every page to be as fast as you can get it. And then again, changes can change up to 28 days. So how do I check my core web vitals? So core web vitals is part of 200 ranking signals that Google already uses. So they're just introducing it into that. And you can check how Google reports your core web vitals using the PageSpeed Insights tool. I believe I will have it linked in the resources where you can test that, and it'll actually show your field data for your site as well as any other site you want to look at. So if you want to check out your competitors and see how they're doing, because most of the time you just have to beat your competitors. You have to get at least into the orange, preferably into the green, and then as long as you're doing better than competitors, you're probably fine. There's also a few other resources. Again, the web.dev, Lighthouse in your browser. I prefer the online tools because Lighthouse in your browser can differ from device to device, and that can lead to inconsistent capture, especially if you're agreeing with your clients on a specific goal you're trying to reach with these metrics. It can be tricky when that's being measured differently from every device tested. So again, Lighthouse Hp Insights. There are benefits and downsides to each one. Generally, if you're going for speed, you want to focus on PageSpeed Insights first. The Lighthouse, it just has extra tool, or the web.dev has extra tools that'll give you scores for your best practices and SEO and accessibility. So let's look at some real world PageSpeed Insights scores. So first we have Reddit, which gets a 33, and PageSpeed Insights will first give you a number from zero, a strength, just kind of an overall performance score from 0 to 100. This is not your core web vitals. This can kind of correlate with core web vitals, but they're not directly connected. You can pass core web vitals and still have a bad score. So if you look, Reddit has a 33 on performance, and they need to work on their LCP. It looks like their LCP is poor at 5 seconds. And then you have Microsoft and Netflix. Again, these are major, everybody knows these names. And they're not quite hitting the mark on their core web vitals yet. Go to the next set of pages. So these are some larger pages that do pass core web vitals. The first and the most important one I want to point out is Amazon. So Amazon has only 1 point better than Reddit. Objectively a bad performance score, but look at their core web vitals. And by the way, I forgot to mention this. If you look, the core web vitals are denoted by the blue check mark or the blue bookmark. And so you can see they're passing all of their core web vitals. So it actually doesn't matter that their performance is not great. They're getting the full search benefit. What does matter is if you want to outrank Amazon and for some reason you have equal relevance, well, then you just have to get a little bit faster than, actually 1.7 is a pretty good LCP, but you can improve on this. And that may lead to better scores. Next, we have Wikipedia. And so Wikipedia is, everybody knows that site, but the great thing about Wikipedia is it's not a very JavaScript or media heavy site. It's almost kind of plain HTML and CSS. And again, they get about the same score as Amazon does for their core web vitals. And the last is Google. So the interesting is that just because it's a Google service does not mean it's going to score well on core web vitals, especially with things like YouTube embeds. YouTube embeds and also Vimeo embeds drag down your site greatly. That's why you have to, it's super critical to have things like lazy loading, because just the problem with this metric is that a lot of the Google products still, they just still fail them. And so and Google doesn't discount, if Google is failing your product, they don't discount the score. They don't remove that. You're still going to fail the scoring and not get the core web vitals benefit, even if it's Google's fault. And so that's a critical thing to remember. Just lazy loading and things like Google Analytics, things like Tag Manager that you're adding on, those will have an impact. You can't, just because it's a Google product doesn't mean it gets to not get counted. So passing core web vitals. So one of my favorite ways to get sites optimized is just by using modern web development tools. One of my personal favorites is Jamstack applications and static sites, just because you have so much more control over the front end code, as well as how you're rendering your HTML. And there's no server. There's no server rendering the HTML, at least. And so it's one of the easiest barriers to entry, lowest barriers to entry, I should say, to getting great scores on core web vitals. And if you're generating static things, you can get all kinds of performance benefits out of this. It isn't always possible to build a new site and to use some of these tools, but there are a few other upgrade solutions. So getting into one of the other options is a lot of sites, and 40% of sites are WordPress. So that's obviously going to be a big question. It's like, okay, what do I do if we're on WordPress and we're not? We want to have significant impact. And you can improve WordPress on its own. But one great solution that I've seen a lot of people start using is using Headless Wordpress, which is where you pull in the data from from the native WordPress REST API, or the newer unofficial GraphQL API for WordPress, and you use that content that's hosted in WordPress to generate a static site, such as a Next.js site, or a Gatsby site, or Next if you're on Vue, and that gives you an incredible amount of control of your performance, and also your application as a whole. One of the bummer parts about WordPress is that you have to know specifically how to hook things in, and you're depending on other plugins to have updates and things like that. And shifting over to something like Headless, or something where you're controlling the markup, gives you a whole lot more control over that, and you're not as much of a victim to things like plugins and updates. So for existing sites, the biggest thing is going to be images. If you're not starting, and a lot of people can't start from scratch. So images is lazy loading and more specifically preloading. So if you don't already know what lazy loading is, it's basically if an image is below the fold, if it's not on the screen, then it doesn't load for the initial view. So when they first, let's say, well, actually this is a web page. So let's say we have this passing core web vitals header, and we have the text. If this were a page we could scroll, and we were to scroll down, there would actually be a JavaScript event triggered, or maybe an intersection observer triggered when we scroll to that, right before we scroll that image, and it gets loaded in as we scroll over it. And this leads to so much performance benefit. Another thing is making sure your images are compressed correctly. WordPress does a pretty decent job of doing this automatically. So other CMSs can have mixed results. Some of them will be really good, some of them won't be so good. So you just have to make sure you have good image optimization running. And if you don't, you can always try something like a third-party CDN. And then preloading is actually it's a concept that for those that do lazy loading all the time, and even just ways to automatically do it, preloading is a much more specific, nuanced way to load an image. And it's basically when you have an image that's that's within the first view that's above the fold and it has to load, you actually don't want to lazy load it, and it might make the performance worse. You can actually go the opposite direction and tell the browser, like, hey, I want you to load this as a first. I want you to prioritize it. And that will actually, that's a big problem that people are running into when they're trying to lazy load every single thing, is that they don't realize they can, they need to preload the images if they're going to be above the fold. And this can actually, preloading these images, when it's set up correctly, will actually lead to a better performance score than lazy loading everything. As long as you're lazy loading everything else below the fold. And the next thing is just the page speed and Lighthouse recommendations. Those testing sites will give you recommendations on specific things that you need to improve and work on. And those are actually really good details to follow, and just going through all of those. And you don't necessarily have to fix all of them, but you can focus on maybe the worst offenders or the easiest to knock out, and those can get you a lot pretty far. And then there's other caching solutions such as Cloudflare DNS that will cache your server-side requests. So it's becoming less and less relevant for performance backend. Performance backend still has an impact, but there's just so much caching that can happen now. Most of the improvement is going to be within the front end and fixing front end issues. And if you're on WordPress, you can use static plugins. I don't know if things like Shopify or Craft have things like static plugins. I imagine there's something up there. And then subdomain charting. This is where so let's say you have a site, you have a critical core product that needs to be faster than the rest, but you don't want to give up your old system yet. So you can separate that content by subdomains. So one subdomain will be the optimized content, and the other one will be kind of like a WordPress blog or a store, like a side store that doesn't necessarily need to be super fast. And then there's a hybrid static site. This is a newer style of rendering that I've been trying out, where you'll import your static content, and then you'll render a static site on top of that existing static content. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. You can do this with again, a WordPress site, but it's static content, so it can be any kind of site. It can be a Squarespace or whatever you want, but it's doing a freeze frame of that site, storing that to a file system, and then letting a Jamstack framework such as Next or Eleventy write or merge in its statically generated files over that. And with the final product that gets deployed is all static. And so you still have that benefit and security benefit from static content. That is my presentation. So hopefully that was enough information, and now we can go into questions.